Well, thank you very much for having us, Marianne. And it's always an honor and pleasure to present at ISNTD. And we also want to dedicate this presentation in the memory of Cameron, who has been an amazing champion of ISNTD, and obviously Marianne, to you and your family. So with that, my name is Kishor Wasan. I'm the co-founder and co-director of the Neglected Global Diseases Initiative at the University of British Columbia. And with me is my colleague and, by chance, my son, John Paul Wasan, who is a soil scientist at the University of Saskatchewan. And today we have kind of an unusual and interesting presentation for our audience today, which is the effects of climate change on soil health and the impact on global spread of NTDs. And particularly, the focus is on the role of soil science and collaborations with lab management. So with that, I'll pass it over to John Paul to talk about the first part of the presentation. John Paul?
All righty. Yeah. So, we've been hearing throughout today about how climate change is increasing temperature, humidity, precipitation, and how this is expanding the range of vectors and NTDs. But, climate is not the only determinant of vector and NTD establishment. There are other factors at play. There's human influence, so how the land is being used. Is it agricultural? Is it urban? The transport of these diseases through shipping, for example. And if the ecosystem is very disturbed, you can imagine if all the insects in an area were killed off, it would be easier for a mosquito vector, for example, to establish. Another thing that's important to remember is that these vectors are living organisms, and some of these NTDs are living organisms, and they have their own natural predators and pathogens. And so when they move into a new range, are they are they escaping those enemies, or are they facing new enemies in these areas? And so if they are facing new enemies, they're introduced with their old enemies, then they may not establish very well. But if they're able to escape their natural predators, you can imagine this is a worst case scenario where they're able to proliferate in the environment. And finally, what I want to talk about most today is the hydrology. And so how does the precipitation actually interact with the surface? Because it may or may not necessarily cause standing water, flooding, runoff, all these concerns we have with NTDs. It depends on the properties. And so the idea that I want to propose to you today is that the soil environment can be understood as a mediator between those climatic, human, and biotic factors. And so what might that look like then? So what are some factors then that may be related to NTDs and vectors? So in the case of soil transmitted helminths, things like what is the soil temperature and the moisture content at that egg or larval stage versus the runoff that's being experienced. So can the eggs be transmitted into water bodies? In terms of mosquito vectors, having lots of standing water, eutrophication, temperature, things that will facilitate the breeding and the larval development. And sometimes the soil itself may actually be the source of the NTDs. So, for example, podoconiosis is this form of lymphoderma that causes swelling in the legs and feet, mainly among barefoot farmers. And it's because of the weathering of this unique volcanic rock that's releasing these irritating minerals and causing the disease. So there is a link between the soil factors and the spread of these NTDs. And so it's really important to consider novel approaches. And all day you've probably been hearing about these novel approaches. And so the second idea that I want to introduce is not just soil as a mediator, but soil health. So in ecology and agriculture, we understand healthy soils to be those that provide benefits and services like biodiversity, water quality, agricultural production. But the idea that we've been working on for a little while is it possible that healthy soils also prevent the spread of NTDs? And like public health, can we improve and manage our soil health for this objective. And so for the rest of my section, I want to talk about some management techniques that may help address the spread of NTDs in these novel ranges under climate change. And so the first factor here, talking about dealing with standing water. So standing water, maybe is due to a few factors. One is where the groundwater table is sitting on the soil surface. So the dashed line in the figure here represents where the water is sitting in the soil profile. And then you can see there's this dip in the landscape. And then that dip is where the water is most likely to accumulate. And so these are going to be our areas of risk when we're talking about standing water or flash flooding occurring, and they can be quite variable. And another big concern is how the water is actually moving through the soil. So in the left pullout here, you can see some rectangles, and those are meant to represent the clays which are present in the soils. Typically, there's a very high clay content in tropical soils. And you can imagine if they're all stacked together like that, it's very difficult to have downward water movement. It has to go back and forth, side to side. And it's these areas that are going to be the highest risk for flash flooding, for precipitation and runoff, because they don't have the ability to deal with that increased intensity and frequency of precipitation. So, for example, we might see something like this water body here, where it seems very flat, but because of either the soil properties or where the groundwater table is sitting, we have some standing water on the surface. So what can we do about it? Well, we can plant deep-rooted vegetation. So what that would do is suck that water down. It would create more pores or holes in the soil that allow for downward movement, and it would allow that this particular area on the landscape to better react to increased precipitation. So increasing that downward movement with this vegetation. Another major concern with NTDs, of course, is water quality and drinking water quality. And so I mentioned eutrophication previously, and eutrophication is the elevated nutrient levels in a water body, and these can stimulate the breeding and the development of NTDs or vectors, for example, mosquitoes. And this often is due to runoff, carrying manure, fertilizers, organic matter into that water body. And then another thing with water quality is that same runoff can also transport diseases. I mentioned helminths previously and other vectors into that water body where they accumulate and get into the drinking water. And so two concerns here. So how can we manage that? We can try to control it at the source. And so you can see here this river, there's a lot of vegetation alongside it. You can see the diversity of shrubs and trees and such. And what this vegetation here at the edge can do is actually provide filtration because of the deep root system. And that filtration can stop the runoff of those organic contaminants of the water. It can slow the movement of perhaps some of those diseases and those vectors into the water. And we call this a riparian area. And we can do a similar thing actually in agriculture. These are called buffer strips. And again, similar idea. You plant those deep-rooted plants that are able to buffer against the movement into the water. This is also agriculturally very important as well, because it helps make sure that those nutrients remain on site and available for the crops that the farmer is growing. So both ways it's very helpful. And if you go back to the previous image I was showing you, you can note now, you see that there's a dramatic difference in the amount of vegetation that's around the water body. And why is that? Well, it's actually in this image because of heavy livestock use. The livestock have really targeted the vegetation at this water body. And so you can imagine then if we had vegetation here, like in the left image, there would be much less risk. So it's not just necessarily the inherent characteristics or even the vegetation we have on the landscape, but how we manage the landscape and how we use the landscape. And so if we can modify how we use the landscape, if we know that there's going to be a risk, that is a great opportunity. And the last thing I want to talk about here is soil mapping. So these soil properties, as I've been mentioning, are highly variable. And it's really important to have detailed maps, just like when we having those detailed maps of endemic diseases, for example. We can have detailed maps of soil properties. And so you can see in this image, just in the span of a few kilometers, we can have quite diverse soil properties. And some of those areas are going to be higher risk for flooding, for runoff than other areas. And so having that information is very critical, and it's not always available in every part of the world. And for example, in the case of poniconiosis, as I was talking about, for many years, having that limited mapping was a challenge in managing the disease because it was difficult to identify the areas of greatest concern. And so to wrap up this idea of managing soil, we can understand the soil as this mediator between the factors, and we can promote the health of our soil to limit the spread of NTDs and vectors. But, and this is where we transition, the land management can't work alone, right? It's not going to be this strategy that works alone. We have to try to limit the available habitat for these vectors and these diseases, but we also need to have effective and accessible treatments for NTDs. And that is not my area of expertise, but it is Dr. Wasan's area of expertise. So I'll turn over the presentation to him.
Well, thank you very much, John Paul. In the last 5 minutes of the presentation, and I'll go very fast, I want to build on what John Paul is saying, is that it's also obviously a multifactorial, multidisciplinary strategy that we need in order to be able to understand how climate change is affecting the spread and the propagation of NTDs, and then develop strategies to be able to address that from a drug development perspective. So from a drug development perspective, as we've already heard from many talks today, the influence of increasing temperature, precipitation, and flooding, humidity, insect infestation. But two other aspects that I think is really important that we have to take into account. Number one is the increase in violent storms, which damage infrastructure, so that if you're trying to get a drug out to people in rural communities, they may not have the medical facilities because it's been damaged because of violent storms as a result of climate change. And finally, as John Paul has mentioned, altered soil environment influencing the impact of precipitation and insect infestation is critical. Thus, we need to develop drug formulations and drug delivery systems that are cost-effective, safe, tropically stable, and accessible, requiring minimal healthcare personnel for administration, so that we are able to have a robust drug that can overcome the effects of climate change on these aspects of drug delivery. So earlier today, you heard a great presentation about leishmaniasis in Europe as being an epidemic. And this is actually quite interesting. In fact, at the American Society of Tropical Medicine meeting in Chicago a few weeks ago, they announced about cutaneous leishmaniasis potentially being an epidemic in the United States, which is actually quite interesting. And they actually indirectly thought that might have to do with climate change, that now environments in the southern United States are now ripe for the sandfly, which leads to leishmaniasis. So in my last 2 or 3 minutes, I just want to give you a case of what we've done to develop a drug delivery system that's robust against climate change for NTDs in the case of leishmaniasis. So leishmaniasis, I'm not going to go in detail, is a devastating disease. The sandfly comes along and stings you, releases a parasite that can spread into the liver or the spleen and lead to different forms of leishmaniasis, the cutaneous form on your skin, and the more systemic form, visceral leishmaniasis, that can lead to death. And this is really a real world efficacy problem. And in fact, in the regions of the world where we see leishmaniasis on this map, if I show you the next slide, if you overlay that to changes in temperature and changes in humidity and precipitation, you can see that the pattern is very, very similar. So these are ripe areas because of climate change has led to ripe areas of leishmaniasis. So we've developed, of course, amphotericin B is one of the mainstays in the treatment of bloodborne fungal infections and parasitic infections. However, the major problem with amphotericin B, it's got low solubility and permeability. It's got low oral bioavailability. It has to be given as a parenteral administration, as an IV infusion. And the problem with that is that it may not be cost effective. There are side effects from the infusion. It's not accessible, and one of the main formulations that is being used parenterally is not tropically stable. It is also a very effective drug in the treatment of many systemic fungal infections secondary to a weak immune system. Won't talk about that today, but this drug has got widespread use. The current treatments for leishmaniasis are liposomal AMP-B, miltefosine, and paromomycin, and each has their own safety or limitations. The liposomal AMP-B, you have to give it parenterally, as I mentioned, and it's not cost-effective or tropically stable, but very, very effective. It's the accessibility of getting that drug to people in rural communities. Miltefosine is the only oral product on the market for the treatment of VL, but the problem is its toxicity potential, as well as drug resistance, as well as its formulation stability. It breaks down in very humid climate change environments. Paromomycin is a toxic aminoglycoside that has accessibility problems, and you have to give these painful IM injections. So if we could develop a cost-effective, safe, tropically stable, accessible formulation that could address the limitations of parenteral use, this could be a major, major thing. And this is where the opportunity of developing an oral formulation of amphotericin B came into place. And here are some of the benefits of having an oral amphotericin B. It's easy to administer at home, decreasing the cost of administration, the lack of infusion side effects, the lack of kidney, liver, and GI toxicity, increased accessibility, and it's thermally stable. We can take the medication to people in the rural communities and increase drug adherence. And I'm not going to go through all this data in these last two slides, but just to show you, we have developed an oral formulation of amphotericin B that's cost-effective, that's safe, that's tropically stable, that's accessible, and we have positive human phase 1A and phase 1B data now that we're presenting here. And just yesterday, and this is a very important announcement, the WHO, through their PADO group, have announced that oral amphotericin B is on their priority list for development in the treatment of leishmaniasis in children. That report just came out yesterday. And of course, some of the work that we've done has been cited in that report. And moving forward, we hope to have an oral formulation of AMP-B that addresses the issues of climate change that comes about because of climate change. That's a robust formulation that can be given accessibly to people with VL in the developing world. I'm not going to go through these last two slides about the safety and the importance and advantages of our oral AMP-B. I've already mentioned that. But I will turn it back to John Paul for an overall conclusion of our short presentation. Thank you very much.
Hello. Yeah, so again, the ideas that we've been presenting today, it's important to have these novel approaches as we're dealing with climate change. And so one novel idea we've presented today is the soil environment as a critical mediator. And this idea of how healthy soils and conversely unhealthy soils can aggravate the spread of NTDs under climate change. And number three, how there are these opportunities to manage our land to achieve these healthy soils that can reduce the suitable range for NTDs. But that has to be a multifaceted approach with, as you just heard, these cost-effective, tropically stable drug formulations. And so, it's important, I think, to have these, unique, maybe interdisciplinary partnerships that perhaps with somebody you weren't previously thinking of. Perhaps you didn't think of hearing a agriculture talk today, but there are a lot of great opportunities here to take unique approaches to manage NTDs. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present here today, and we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much.